The day I brought fish soup to our 5th wedding anniversary, my husband was spoon-feeding another woman. He held a fine white porcelain spoon, blew on the porridge until it was cool, then guided it to her lips. His voice, when he told her one last bite, "Sweetheart," held a tenderness I had never once heard. I stood in the hospital doorway, my fingertips blanched white against the hot thermos, but I felt nothing. The woman, Kayla, turned her head and raised an eyebrow at me, a slow curl of triumph. Ethan didn't turn around. "Set it down and go," he said. I didn't move. "Ethan, it's our 5th anniversary." He stood, crossed the room, and snatched the thermos from my hands. Then he hurled it into the trash. It landed with a wet crash. He pushed me, hard, and my shoulder hit the doorframe. "Don't be in the way." I stood there, the pain spreading through my shoulder like a crack in ice. Then I smiled. No tears, no screaming. I walked out, took out my phone, and replied to a message that had been pinned at the top of my screen for 3 years, *OK. "Come get me, *. The reply came instantly, "Stay where you are." Ethan didn't know that I owned the patents that held his company together. Or that I had planted a kill switch in the core code 5 years ago. He didn't know that this was the last chance I was ever going to give him. And he had just thrown it into the trash. The moment I pushed open the hospital room door, I thought I'd walked into the wrong life. The man sitting beside the bed was my husband, Ethan Hawthorne. He was holding a white porcelain spoon, his head bent low, his lips pursed as he blew gently across the steaming porridge. His brow was smooth, his movements slow and deliberate. I had never, not once in 5 years of marriage, seen that expression on his face. "Last bite, sweetheart." His voice was a caress. "Come on, open up." The woman in the bed, Kayla, kept her eyes on me as she let the spoon slide between her lips. She had the look of a cat who'd just lapped up cream. Then she tilted her head and her lips curved, a spark of something taunting and delighted flickering in her gaze. "Ethan, your wife is here." He didn't turn around. Not even a flinch. He scooped up another spoonful of porridge and held it out. "Set it down and go." The words were flat, dismissive, the kind of tone you might use with a delivery person who'd knocked on the wrong door. I stood in the doorway and felt the weight of the thermos in my hand. It was still so hot that the metal burned my palm. I'd boiled water twice before filling it, because I knew the walk from the car to the hospital was long, and I wanted the fish soup to stay warm. Now the heat was searing my fingers, but I couldn't let go. It was the only solid thing in the room. My chest was a hollow ache. A cold fire that wouldn't quite ignite. "Ethan." I heard my own voice, steady and strange. "Today is our 5th wedding anniversary." That, finally, made him stop. He set the spoon down on the tray, stood up, and walked toward me. For one breathless second I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, guilt, maybe, or a memory. But when he reached me, his face was hard. He grabbed the thermos out of my hand so roughly that hot soup splashed over the rim and scalded my wrist. "Kayla nearly died saving my life, and you want to talk about an anniversary?" His voice was quiet, but every syllable was sharpened to a point. Later, much later, I would turn those words over in my mind and almost laugh. Kayla had brought him soup when he was hospitalized with a bleeding ulcer 4 years ago, and he twisted that simple kindness into a life debt so enormous it had swallowed our entire marriage. But right then, in that doorway, the absurdity was lost on me. All I could feel was the sting of the burn and the deeper, colder shock of being thrown away. The trash can was right next to the door. He threw the thermos inside. It landed on its side with a sick thud, the lid popping open, and the pale milky soup seeped out, soaking the discarded gauze and tissues beneath it. I stared at it. 3 hours over the stove. 3 times I'd skimmed the foam. I'd added red dates and a touch of ginger, the way my grandmother taught me. All of it, now seeping into hospital waste. "Go home," Ethan said. "Don't be in the way." His hand pressed against my shoulder and shoved. I was wearing heels. I stumbled backward and my shoulder blade slammed into the doorframe. Pain jagged through my arm and down my spine, so bright and sharp that I saw sparks. I grabbed the doorframe and held on. He was already walking back to her. He sat down, took her hand, and chafed her cold fingers between his palms. "You're still freezing. I'll get the nurse to bring another blanket." That voice. Soft. Careful. Devoted. A voice I had never been allowed to hear, not once, not even on our wedding night, when he'd been tipsy and charming and had called me his partner instead of his love. I had told myself it was just his way, that he wasn't a man for sweet words. But he was. He just hadn't been saying them to me. Something inside me, something I'd been holding together with sheer will for years, cracked all the way through. It wasn't rage. Rage would have been warm, a fire that might have driven me to scream, to throw things, to demand answers. What I felt was colder and quieter. It was the sound of a door closing. A lock turning. A final, irrevocable end. I straightened up, my shoulder throbbing. I looked at the back of his head, at the way he bent toward her as if she were the sun. And I smiled. It was a thin, private smile that I wore just for myself. "Okay," I thought. "You want me out of the way. I'll get so far out of your way you'll never find me again, I turned and walked out of the room. The corridor stretched ahead, long and white and buzzing with fluorescent light. I leaned against the wall, took out my phone, and scrolled through my contacts. It took a long time to find the one I wanted, a name I'd pinned 3 years ago and never opened. The last message, from Leo Grayson, was still there, "I'll wait. No matter how long, I hadn't replied then. I had still believed in marriage, in promises, in the idea that a man's word meant something. I didn't believe any of that now. My hands were shaking, but I typed without hesitation. "I'm ready. Come get me, The reply was instantaneous, as if he'd been holding his phone for 3 years, waiting for this exact moment. "Stay right there. I'm on my way, I looked at the screen, then let my head fall back against the cold wall. Ethan had no idea that he hadn't just thrown away a bowl of soup. He had thrown away his last chance. And chances, with me, were a currency I only spent once. Outside the hospital, the late autumn wind scraped dry leaves along the pavement. My shoulder was beginning to swell. I could feel the heat of it spreading beneath my blouse. I didn't hail a cab. I walked, one block after another, past shop windows and bus stops and a giant LED screen on the side of a mall. It was playing a promotional video for Hawthorne Group. There he was, Ethan Hawthorne, in an immaculate suit, talking to a journalist about vision and innovation and the company's meteoric rise. They called him the youngest business leader in the city. They didn't mention the woman who had built the technology he was selling. I looked down at my hands. They weren't the hands of a pampered wife. There were calluses on my fingertips and palms, a rough patch on the side of my thumb from years of handling chemical reagents. I had spent more nights in the lab than in our bedroom. The synthesis process that Hawthorne Group's entire product line depended on, the one that the PhDs in the technical department could never quite stabilize, that was mine. I had written the parameters, tuned the reactions, built the architecture from scratch. Ethan knew that. He'd just forgotten. Or maybe he'd convinced himself that my work was just a stepping stone, a gift that became his the moment we signed the marriage certificate. My phone buzzed. Margaret Hawthorne. My mother-in-law. I answered and held the phone a few inches from my ear. Claire. Where the hell are you? Ethan said you made a scene at the hospital. Her voice was a drill, high-pitched and relentless. Let me tell you, 𝐃𝐄𝐒 is Ethan's savior. The least you can do is clear out the guest room and make her feel welcome. A useless woman like you who can't even give us a grandchild, you should be grateful you're still Mrs. Hawthorne at all. It's sheer charity on our part. I let her rant. I had heard versions of this speech 100 times. 5 years of it, in fact. The first time she'd called me useless, I'd locked myself in the bathroom and cried. Now it landed like spit on a raincoat. When she paused for breath, I spoke. I've already cleared my space. What's that supposed to mean? I hung up and blocked her number. The villa was dark when I got home. It was my villa, bought with the first investment money my grandfather had left me. Ethan's name was on the deed, but the down payment, the mortgage, the renovations, every cent had come from my accounts. He'd always said, when the company goes public, I'll buy you something bigger. That had never happened, and now 𝐃𝐄𝐒 was moving in. I went into the study. Ethan never came in here. He said it was too messy, too full of my books and papers. He didn't know the combination to the safe. He didn't know what was inside. I pulled out a manila envelope, edges worn, and slid out a thick contract. It was the patent licensing agreement I'd drawn up 5 years ago, back when Hawthorne Group was just a startup and I was still in love with the idea of building something together. The terms were clear. The 3 core patents that Hawthorne Group used were licensed to the company on an annual renewal basis. If I, the patent holder, resigned or chose not to renew, the license would terminate immediately, and all associated technical support and core code maintenance would cease. Ethan's signature was at the bottom, bold and careless. He'd signed without reading. Asterisk, why do we need a contract? We're married, asterisk, he'd said. I told him it was just a formality. He'd believed me. He had never noticed the kill switch I'd written into the core architecture from day one. Without my encryption key, the entire system would start glitching within 48 hours and crash completely within a week. It wasn't malice, not then. It was insurance. My grandfather had taught me never to put all my chips on one man, especially a man who couldn't tell the difference between love and obligation. I took a pen and filled in today's date on the last page. Then I opened my laptop and logged into Hawthorne Group's internal system. Red warnings blazed across the screen. The cash reserves were nearly depleted, accounts payable were piling up, the liquidity ratio was a disaster. Ethan had drained the last of the emergency funds to invest in a wellness resort project on the north side of the city, a project 𝐃𝐄𝐒 had pushed for. He'd done it without even glancing at the geological survey I'd placed on his desk 3 years ago. That survey, which clearly showed the land was sitting on an earthquake fault line and couldn't support high-rise construction, was still in my old filing cabinet, buried under a stack of brochures. I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling the cold, clean certainty of a decision already made. Then I hit enter. The system asked, asterisk, confirm termination of all auto-renewal protocols and lock core maintenance. This action is irreversible, asterisk. I clicked yes. The countdown started. 48 hours until everything Ethan had built began to collapse. I packed a single suitcase. My things were few, some clothes, a few books, a folder of research notes. The closet was full of gowns and jewelry I'd bought to play the role of Mrs. Hawthorne at galas and investor dinners. I left all of it. At the bottom of my bedside drawer, I found a worn envelope. Inside was an ultrasound image, yellowed and creased. 3 years ago, I'd been pregnant. I'd called Ethan from the side of the road, bleeding and terrified after a truck ran a red light and T-boned my car. He hadn't answered. He'd been driving 𝐃𝐄𝐒 back to her apartment, because she'd called him drunk and said she needed him. By the time he remembered to check his phone, the baby was gone. He'd stood in the hospital room, his face pale, and said, *, it was an accident. We're young. We can try again, *, he never said he was sorry. He never mentioned 𝐃𝐄𝐒. And I never let him touch me again. I slipped the ultrasound into my bag. It was the only old thing I was taking with me. The front door opened. Ethan walked in, trailing the sharp chemical scent of hospital disinfectant. He shrugged off his jacket, tossed it on the sofa, and headed for the bar. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" He loosened his tie with one hand, poured himself a whiskey with the other. Ice cubes clinked against crystal. He took a long swallow. I stood up from the shadows and laid the divorce papers on the coffee table. "Ethan, I want a divorce." He stopped, glass halfway to his lips. Then he laughed, a short, humorless sound. "Claire, don't be ridiculous. 𝐃𝐄𝐒 saved my life. I owe her. That doesn't mean. Pay your debt however you want," I said. "But don't use my dignity as currency." He set the glass down hard. The look he gave me was not guilt, not regret, it was irritation. The annoyed look of a man who'd been asked to deal with a problem he didn't think was his. He walked over, close enough that I could smell the whiskey on his breath, and he pinched my chin between his thumb and forefinger, forcing my face up. "You think you can walk away? You think anyone out there will give you the life I've given you? The name, the money, the status, it's all because of me. You should be grateful." His grip tightened. "Learn some gratitude, Claire." I wrenched my chin free. My jaw ached where his fingers had pressed. "The house is mine. The patents are mine. The startup capital, the connections, every door you walked through to build this company, my grandfather gave me all of that." "What did you give me, Ethan?" "A marriage certificate I no longer want." His face darkened. "Your patents would be worthless without me. You think some lab rat like you could turn a formula into a publicly traded company? You can barely hold a conversation with an investor. Without me, you're nothing." He pointed at the door. "You want to leave? Then leave. Get out." I picked up my suitcase and walked. "Claire." His voice stopped me at the threshold. "You walk out that door, don't ever think you can come crawling back." I didn't turn around. "Tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock, at the courthouse. And Ethan, check your company's financial alerts." I stepped into the night. Behind me, I heard the shatter of a whiskey glass against the door. Marcus was waiting by the car. He was a former army medic I'd quietly helped 3 years ago, paying his wife's medical bills and setting them up with a place to live. Ethan had no idea who he really was, he thought Marcus was just a driver. Marcus took my suitcase without a word and opened the door. As the car pulled away, I watched the villa shrink in the side mirror. 5 years of my life inside those walls. I had thought of it as home. Now it was just a building. I pulled out my phone and typed a message to Leo. "I'm free." His reply came before I could put the phone down. "Your lab is waiting." I looked at those words and felt the sting of tears I refused to shed. I was Claire Hastings. I didn't cry. Not anymore. Back at the apartment, a small, clean place I'd kept in my name for years, I opened my laptop and watched Hawthorne Group's internal dashboard hemorrhage red. The accounts were nearly empty. The payroll would bounce within 2 weeks. The wellness resort project was a black hole sucking in what little cash remained. I pulled up the geological survey Ethan had ignored and forwarded it to Rebecca Grayson's team along with a note, "Time to strike." Then I sat in the dark, rubbing my throbbing shoulder, and waited for the phone to ring. It took less than 2 hours. "Claire, what the hell did you do?" Ethan's voice was raw, frayed at the edges. I could hear other voices in the background, panicked and overlapping. The tech team had obviously discovered the lockout. "The system is failing, nothing's updating, the compatibility errors are spreading, the whole production line is going to grind to a halt. What did you do?" I took a sip of cold coffee. "I didn't do anything. I resigned. The licensing agreement we both signed states that if I'm no longer chief architect, the patent license terminates and all technical support stops. That's the contract you signed, Ethan. It's perfectly legal." Silence. I could almost hear the gears grinding in his head as he tried to remember a document he'd never bothered to read. "You planned this," he finally said. "5 years ago. You were planning this all along." "I planned for the possibility. There's a difference." I set the mug down. My grandfather taught me not to put all my eggs in one basket. Especially a basket that throws soup into the trash. "Claire. Tomorrow at 10. Sign the papers, and I'll give your team an extra week of technical support. Don't show up, and your entire system crashes in 48 hours. Your choice." I hung up. The next morning, I stood outside the courthouse at 9:50. Ethan arrived 10 minutes late, stepping out of a Rolls-Royce that looked increasingly like a prop. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw unshaven, his tie crooked. He stumbled slightly as he walked toward me, one hand reaching out as if to steady himself on my arm. I stepped back. His hand hung in the air for a moment, then dropped. "We need to talk about this," he said, voice lowered, as if a softer tone could change the fact that we were standing outside a divorce court. "Whatever you want, money, a settlement, we can work it out." "There's nothing to work out. Sign the papers." "Claire. You sign now, and I keep the system alive for 1 more week. You stall, and I shut it all down today." His face went white. "You'd really do that?" I looked at him. The morning sun was sharp and cold, and it showed every line on his face, every shadow of exhaustion. I thought about the years I'd spent waiting for him to come home, the nights I'd fallen asleep alone in a lab coat, the silent anniversaries I'd marked by myself with a bottle of wine I never opened. "This isn't a threat, Ethan. It's a notification." He stared at me for a long moment, and something in his eyes flickered, fear, maybe, or the realization that I wasn't the woman he thought he'd married. Then his jaw clenched. "Fine." The divorce took 15 minutes. The clerk stamped the papers with a bored expression. I walked out with a slim divorce certificate and a lightness in my chest that felt almost like vertigo. Ethan grabbed my arm outside. "Now give me the key." I shook him off. "You still don't understand. The patents aren't a service you pay for. They're my property. You had a license to use them, and that license is over. There is no key to give you. You'll have to build your own technology. From scratch." I let that sink in. "If you still have a company in a week." His face crumpled. His hand fell away. His phone rang. Kayla's name flashed on the screen. He answered, and his voice instantly shifted back into that soft, protective tone. "I'm coming, baby. Just hold on." He was already walking toward the car, his panic over her eclipsing everything else. He paused just long enough to throw a final, wounded glare over his shoulder. "I'll get lawyers. You won't get away with this." I stood on the courthouse steps and watched him drive away. Then I pulled out my phone. Leo's name was at the top of my messages. "It's done," I typed. "Where are you?" he replied. "Courthouse steps. I'm coming." The next week was a cascade of disasters for Hawthorne Group. News vans camped outside the headquarters. Investors pulled out en masse. The stock price went into free fall, and every business news channel ran the same headline: Hawthorne Group in crisis. The wellness resort project was exposed as a financial sinkhole built on unstable land. An anonymous source had leaked the geological survey to the press, and the company's debt-to-equity ratio was splashed across the front page of the financial section. Ethan scrambled for a white knight, but no one wanted to rescue a company whose core technology was controlled by a woman who had just divorced its CEO. I stayed in my apartment, watching the news with a bowl of oatmeal. On the day Kayla was discharged from the hospital, Ethan had planned a grand romantic gesture, a proposal on a giant LED billboard downtown. He'd reserved the space but hadn't paid the full fee. The screen stayed gray. I saw a photo of Kayla standing under the blank billboard, her smile frozen, and I felt nothing at all. The following Saturday, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in 3 years. "Claire. It's Leo." His voice was exactly the same, low, warm, with a slight rasp that made it sound like he was always about to laugh. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. "You're back. Just landed. Heard you're a free woman. I came to take you out for hot pot." A pause. "If you're up for it." I looked at myself in the mirror. I'd lost weight. My collarbones jutted out more sharply, and there were shadows under my eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. "Send me the address." "You sure?" "I might laugh at how skinny you've gotten. You waited 3 years. I don't think a few pounds is going to scare you off." He laughed. The sound of it, after all this time, made something loosen in my chest. The restaurant was an old-school hot pot place in the old district, steam fogging the windows and chili peppers bobbing in bubbling red broth. Leo stood up when I walked in, and for a moment I just looked at him. He was still the same, white shirt, wire-rimmed glasses, that quiet, razor-sharp intelligence behind his eyes. But there was something steadier about him now. A depth that hadn't been there before. "You look like you haven't slept in a year," he said, and pulled out my chair. "Busy year." He didn't ask for details. He just ladled a slice of tripe into my bowl and said, "Eat." We talked about the patents, about the kill switch, about the geological report. Leo listened without interrupting, the way he used to back in grad school, when I'd rant about an experiment that wasn't working and he'd quietly hand me a cup of tea. When I finished, he pulled out a small navy blue box and set it on the table. "Not a ring," he said. Inside was a key, engraved with my initials, CH below them, the name of a newly built independent research lab. "Rebecca and I have set up a new R&D center. I'm a partner. I want you to be the director. No more building anyone else's empire. Just your own work, your own team, your own discoveries." I picked up the key. It was cool and solid in my palm. I thought about the lab I'd built for Ethan, the one where I'd slowly been pushed aside until my name was just a formality on the door. This key felt different. It felt like permission to be myself again. "Thank you," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended. He raised his beer. "To your freedom." Our glasses clinked. And that was when the door slammed open. Ethan stood there, reeking of whiskey, his shirt untucked, his hair a wild mess. Behind him, 2 waiters hovered helplessly. His eyes found me and Leo, and something in them ignited. "Claire. I knew it. I knew you had someone else all along." He stormed to our table and slammed his palm down so hard that the broth sloshed over the rim of the pot. A splash of red oil landed on Leo's sleeve. "This is your boyfriend. You were cheating on me with him." Leo set down his glasses with a calm, deliberate motion and wiped his sleeve with a napkin. "Mr. Hawthorne, public place. Lower your voice. She's destroying my company. She planted a virus in my system, she's colluding with Grayson Group to buy me out, and you want me to lower my voice?" Ethan's voice cracked into a shout. Heads turned. Someone raised a phone to record. I saw the glint of a camera lens and felt a cold, sharp satisfaction. "The patents are mine," I said, standing. "The code is mine. You were a licensee, not an owner. And if you'd read a single contract I put in front of you, you'd know that." He lunged. His hand grabbed for my hair. Leo moved faster. He caught Ethan's wrist, twisted it behind his back, and shoved him into the next table. Bowls and plates shattered on the floor. Ethan stumbled, splattered with sauce, his face white with shock and pain. "Don't touch her," Leo said. His voice was still quiet, but it had an edge that could cut glass. Ethan wrenched himself free and staggered back, chest heaving. He looked at me, and for a second the rage in his eyes cracked open, revealing something rawer underneath. Fear, maybe, or the first bitter taste of consequence. "You'll regret this, Claire. I'll make 𝐃𝐄𝐒 the chairwoman. You'll see. You'll watch everything you built belong to her." "The shares you pledged are underwater," I said. "The land you bought is on an earthquake fault line. The geological report has been on your desk for 3 years. You just never read it." I sat back down and picked up my chopsticks. "Go home, Ethan. Well, you still have one." He stood there, dripping, trembling, the whole restaurant watching. Then he turned and stumbled out into the night. Leo handed me a fresh napkin. "You okay?" "I'm fine." I wiped a spot of oil from the table. "Actually, I'm better than fine." That night, the video of the confrontation went viral. The headline the next morning read, "Hawthorne CEO assaults ex-wife in restaurant. Grayson Group heir intervenes." By Monday, Hawthorne's remaining shareholders were calling for an emergency meeting. In the desperate weeks that followed, Ethan did exactly what I expected. He appointed 𝐃𝐄𝐒 as executive vice president and transferred 10% of his remaining shares to her name. The announcement photo showed her draped in a Chanel suit, diamonds at her throat, smiling the smile of a woman who thought she'd won. Margaret Hawthorne checked herself into the hospital, ranting about witchcraft and gold diggers. She called me from a nurse's phone, her voice a wreck of fury and tears. "Claire, you have to stop him. That woman is bleeding him dry." I was reviewing acquisition documents at the time. "I'm not his wife anymore, Margaret. I'm not going to stop anything." I ended the call and went back to work. Rebecca Grayson launched the takeover bid the following Monday. With the stock in free fall and panic spreading through the market, Grayson Group began scooping up shares at a steep discount. I sat in the glass-walled conference room on the top floor and watched the numbers tick upward. 45%. 47. 49. The controlling stake was within reach. The afternoon sun turned the skyscraper windows gold. Leo stood beside me, arms crossed. He's pledging his last shares to loan sharks to fund that resort project. He thinks it's going to save him. It won't. I pulled up the geological report on my tablet and pushed it across the table. The land is unbuildable. He'll lose everything. I was right. Kayla, meanwhile, had her own plans. She'd convinced Ethan to transfer the last $3 million of emergency capital into her account to manage the project. 3 days later, the account was empty, and Kayla had vanished. The police found her at the border with a fake passport and a suitcase full of cash. She'd been planning her exit for months. But she hadn't planned on the Border Patrol database flagging her forged documents. They arrested her at the checkpoint, still wearing the diamond earrings Ethan had bought her with money he didn't have. Ethan came to Grayson headquarters unannounced, looking like a man who'd been dragged behind a car. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes hollow. He wasn't allowed past the lobby until I gave the word. When he finally sat across from me in the conference room, he couldn't meet my eyes. "She's gone," he said. "The money's gone. My mother is paralyzed. She had a stroke when she heard. The loan sharks are outside my building every day." He pressed his palms against his thighs, trying to stop them from shaking. "I don't know what to do." I poured him a glass of water. He didn't touch it. "Why did you make her VP?" I asked. His laugh was a horrible, broken sound. "She said she was pregnant. Said she wanted our child to have a real family. I thought if I gave her everything, she'd stay." He covered his face with his hands. "It was all a lie. The pregnancy test was fake. The baby wasn't mine. She had another man the whole time." When I confronted her about the missing funds, she laughed at me. She actually laughed. I listened and felt nothing. Not pity, not satisfaction, not even the dull ache of old wounds. Just a vast, quiet emptiness where love and hate used to be. "You want me to save you," I said. "You're the only one who can. The algorithm, if you just optimize the production line, we can still turn things around. I'll give you anything. Name your price." I opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "Sign this." It was a full asset transfer agreement. Every remaining share, every property, every patent license held by Hawthorne Group, all of it, signed over to Grayson Group. Ethan stared at the page, and the color drained from his face. "You want to swallow the whole company." "Grayson Group wants to swallow it," I said. "I'm just the person who makes sure the paperwork is correct. Sign it, and Grayson will cover your debts. You'll avoid prison for embezzlement and fraud. Refuse, and the police will be here by morning." His hand trembled so violently that the pen scratched the paper. He signed his name in a jagged, jerky scrawl, and when he was done, he pushed the document back toward me. Then he dropped his head onto his folded arms and wept, ugly, heaving sobs that shook his shoulders. I sat there, dry-eyed, until the security guards came to escort him out. Hawthorne Group was gone. The company was renamed Hastings and Grayson Technologies. Rebecca kept a controlling stake, but the technical authority was returned to me. Leo became my co-founder, and we moved into the old executive offices. I found Kayla's framed photographs still hanging on the wall of what had been my office. I took them down myself, one by one, and dropped them into the trash. On my first day, I found a framed photo tucked behind a stack of old reports, a picture of Ethan and me on our first anniversary. I was beaming, leaning into his shoulder, my face full of a hope that looked almost childlike now. I placed it face down on the desk and left it there. Later, I would ask Marcus to throw it out with the rest of the debris. The first major project was a next-generation biopharmaceutical patent. The press conference was a circus of flashing cameras. A reporter shouted over the crowd, "Miss Hastings. Any comment on your ex-husband's current situation?" I smiled into the lens. Hastings and Grayson is a new chapter. I don't discuss old footnotes. Leo's hand found mine under the table and squeezed. After the conference, I found a message from Margaret on my phone. Her voice was a rasping whisper now, filled with coughs. "Claire, please, help him. He's been beaten. The debt collectors came to the house. They're going to break his hands." A pause, the rattle of labored breathing. "For the sake of what you once had, please." I deleted the message without replying. That night, Leo drove me home through the old district. He slowed the car near a grimy food stall. A man in a stained undershirt was crouched beside a pile of dirty dishes, his arms elbow-deep in gray dishwater. He was gaunt, his hair mostly white, his back bent. A heavy-set boss stood over him, screaming, "Faster, you useless piece of trash. You break another bowl and I'll take it out of your pay." It was Ethan. He looked up just as our car rolled past. His eyes met mine through the window. The bowl in his hand slipped and shattered. The boss's tirade rose to a roar. Ethan didn't move. He just stared at me, his face a mask of shock and something that might have been recognition, of who I really was, of what he'd thrown away. I turned my head and faced forward. Leo's hand rested on the back of my seat. We drove on. That night, I stood in the lab, surrounded by the quiet hum of machines. Leo came in with 2 cups of coffee. "You've been in here for 6 hours. I'm calibrating the new reactor." I didn't look up. This is what I was built to do. He set the coffee down and leaned against the counter, watching me with a small, unreadable smile. "You know, I asked you once, in grad school, what you wanted most. You said, a lab that's mine, and a partner who doesn't make me smaller." He tilted his head. "How am I doing?" I finally looked at him. The harsh lab light carved shadows under his cheekbones. He had waited 3 years, and in all that time he had never pushed, never demanded, never made me feel like I owed him a single thing. "You're doing fine," I said. Really, really fine. The months that followed were a whirlwind of work and quiet joy. The lab became my sanctuary. I hired a team of brilliant young researchers, some of them women who reminded me of myself a decade ago, hungry and underestimated. I made sure they never had to fight for credit the way I had. I published 3 papers in top journals. I keynote conferences. I stopped flinching when people called me brilliant. Leo was there through all of it, not hovering, not managing, just present. He had his own work, his own projects, and he pursued them with the same quiet intensity he'd had in grad school. We fell into a rhythm, early morning coffee in the lab, lunch at our desks, dinner whenever we both remembered to eat. Sometimes I'd look up from a microscope and find him watching me with an expression I couldn't quite name. Pride, maybe, or wonder. It made me feel like something precious, something worth waiting for. One evening, 6 months after the takeover, Leo and I were walking along the riverfront when my phone buzzed with a notification from the prison system. Kayla Moore had been sentenced to 7 years for fraud, embezzlement, and attempted flight from prosecution. Her lawyer had argued for leniency, citing her difficult childhood and her genuine affection for Ethan. The judge hadn't bought it. I read the news, slipped my phone back into my pocket, and kept walking. Anything important? Leo asked. Just the universe settling its accounts, I said. He didn't press. He just took my hand, and we walked on in the gathering dusk. Margaret Hawthorne passed away that winter. I learned of it through a terse email from the nursing home where she'd spent her final months. The message was addressed to the family of Margaret Hawthorne, and I almost deleted it without reading. But something made me open it. She had died alone, the email said, in the early hours of a Tuesday morning. There were no visitors listed in her log. Ethan had been unable to make the journey from his rented room across town. The bus fare was more than he could spare. I forwarded the email to Leo and then deleted it. I didn't attend the funeral. But I did send a small arrangement of white lilies, and signed. Not for her. For the version of myself who had once believed that if she just tried hard enough, she could earn that woman's love. 18 months after the divorce, Hastings and Grayson Technologies went public at a valuation that made the front page of every financial outlet. My name appeared on the Forbes list of top women in business. At the celebratory dinner, on the rooftop of the city's tallest building, with the skyline glittering around us like a handful of scattered diamonds, Leo knelt down in front of everyone and opened a red velvet box. This time, it was a ring. Claire Hastings. His voice carried over the hum of the city below. I don't want you to be Mrs. Anything. I don't want you to be the CEO or the genius behind the patents or the woman who took down Hawthorne Group. I just want you to be Claire, the girl who once solved a protein folding equation and danced around the lab at 2 in the morning. Marry me. Please. I looked at him, at the open, earnest, waiting hope in his eyes, and the tears I'd been holding back for years finally slipped free. I'm difficult, I said, my voice thick. I'm not gentle. I hold grudges. I know. He slid the ring onto my finger. That's my favorite part. I laughed, a wet, broken, joyful sound, and said, yes. We married in a small ceremony on a cliff overlooking the Pacific, with the wind in our faces and the sunset spilling gold across the water. Rebecca was my maid of honor. Marcus gave a toast that made everyone cry. And when Leo lifted my veil and kissed me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the quiet, steady certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. 3 years later, our daughter was born. We named her Elena, after my grandmother, the woman whose fish soup recipe I had poured into that thermos on the worst day of my life. Elena had Leo's dark curls and my stubborn chin. She laughed easily and slept badly and wrapped her tiny fingers around my thumb with a grip that felt like destiny. I held her in the hospital room, looking down at her scrunched, perfect face, and thought about the baby I'd lost. That grief would never fully leave me, I knew that now. It was a scar, not a wound. It had healed over, but it was still there, a faint silver line on the landscape of my heart. I kissed Elena's forehead and whispered, I'm going to give you the world, little one. And I'm going to teach you how to build your own. Motherhood changed me. Not in the soft, hazy way the magazines described, but in a sharper, fiercer way. I became more protective, more deliberate, more unwilling to waste a single moment on anything that didn't matter. I delegated more at work. I learned to say no. I left the office at 5:30 every day, and I didn't apologize for it. Leo picked up the slack without being asked, and when I thanked him, he looked genuinely confused. She's my daughter too, he said. This isn't a favor. This is fatherhood. I had spent so many years with a man who made me feel like a burden. It still surprised me, sometimes, to be with someone who treated partnership like breathing, effortless, essential, not something you kept score of. 5 years after the divorce, on a warm Saturday afternoon, I was pushing Elena on a swing in the park near our house. She was 2 years old, a whirlwind of giggles and scraped knees, and she had just discovered the joy of going, "Higher, Mama, higher," when a stooped, white-haired man in a cleaner's uniform stumbled after a runaway trash bag and nearly fell. He caught himself on the swing frame, and when he looked up, I saw his face. Ethan. He'd been released early for good behavior. The years in prison and on the streets had carved him hollow. His hands were knotted and scarred, his eyes sunken. His uniform hung loose on a frame that had once been broad and powerful. He froze when he recognized me, and his gaze dropped to the little girl clinging to my leg. "Is she?" His voice was a dry rasp, barely audible over the creak of the swings. "How old?" "2, I said. He nodded slowly, and something in his face cracked open. He was looking at Elena the way a man might look at a house he used to live in, longing and loss and the terrible knowledge that he could never go back. If our child had lived, they'd be in school now. I pulled my daughter closer. The wind blew a swirl of leaves between us, and I watched one catch in his white hair. He seemed to be waiting for something, an absolution, a word of forgiveness, some crumb of grace that would let him believe his suffering had meant something. But I had none to give. I had burned all of that long ago. The forgiveness I had found was not for him, it was for myself, for the woman I used to be, for the years I'd spent blaming myself for his failures. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "For everything." I looked at him for a long moment. The park was full of families, children laughing, dogs barking, the ordinary music of a Saturday afternoon. And in the middle of it all stood a man who had once been my whole world, now reduced to a ghost in a cleaner's uniform. "Take care of yourself, Ethan," I said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even kindness, really. It was just the truth. I didn't wish him ill. I didn't wish him anything at all. I turned away. I heard his footsteps retreat, the creak of the trash cart's wheels. Elena looked up and asked, "Mama, why is that man crying?" I smoothed her hair, bent down, and kissed the top of her head. Maybe the wind got in his eyes. That was the last time I ever saw him. Ethan died a year later. I learned the details from Marcus, who still had contacts throughout the city and who understood, without my having to ask, that I would want to know. He'd been working as a janitor at a community center, living in a rented room barely larger than a closet. His health had been failing for months, his liver, the doctors said, damaged beyond repair by years of hard drinking. He'd refused treatment. He told the social worker assigned to his case that he didn't see the point. In his final weeks, he'd started visiting a small church near his apartment. Not for services, he'd never been religious, but because it was quiet, and no one asked him questions. The pastor there, a young woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner, had been the one to find him. He died in a pew near the back, his head bowed, his hands folded in his lap. He looked peaceful, she told Marcus. Like someone who had finally put down a heavy weight. His possessions fit into a single cardboard box. Among them, the social worker found a crumpled, yellowed piece of paper. It was a recipe for fish soup, written in my handwriting, the ink smeared and faded from years of folding and unfolding. The nurses at the community hospital where he'd been treated said it looked as if he'd fished it out of the trash the very night I left and held on to it ever since, through the divorce, through prison, through the slow, grinding years of his decline. It was the only thing of mine he'd kept. They also found a receipt for a donation he'd made 3 weeks before his death. He'd given every cent he had, less than $500, to a foundation for families who had lost children. The foundation I had started, years ago, in the name of the baby I never got to hold. I don't know how he found out about it. Maybe he'd read about it in one of the business profiles that mentioned my name. Maybe someone had told him. Maybe he'd just been looking for a way to say he was sorry. I sat with that information for a long time. I sat on the porch of our house, watching the sun set behind the hills, and I tried to feel something: grief, regret, a flicker of the old love I'd once carried for him. But there was nothing. Just a quiet stillness, like a lake with no wind. I didn't visit his grave. I didn't send flowers. But I did keep a copy of the donation receipt, tucked into the back of my lab notebook. Not as a memorial. As a reminder. A reminder that some people spend their whole lives learning the lessons that others learn in a single afternoon. A reminder that the man I had married had not been entirely a monster. He had been weak, and selfish, and cruel in his carelessness, but somewhere beneath all of that, there had been a flicker of something that might have been goodness, if he'd ever bothered to nurture it. And a reminder that I had been right to leave. The years that followed were full and bright and entirely my own. Hastings and Grayson Technologies grew into a global leader in biopharmaceutical innovation. We developed treatments for diseases that had been considered untreatable. We opened research centers in 3 countries. I testified before Congress on patent reform, using my own story, carefully anonymized, as a case study in why inventors needed stronger legal protections against predatory licensing practices. The bill that eventually passed bore the unofficial nickname Claire's Law, though I never claimed it publicly. Leo framed a copy of the congressional record and hung it in my office. "You changed the world," he said. "Not just your world. The world." Elena grew up surrounded by science and love. She had her father's steady patience and my insatiable curiosity, and by the time she was 10, she could explain CRISPR to her classmates with the casual confidence of someone who'd grown up hearing about gene editing at the dinner table. She built her first robot at 12 and her first app at 14. When she was 16, she asked me about my first marriage. I told her the truth, not all of it, but enough. I told her about the fish soup and the hospital room and the patents and the kill switch. I told her about the baby I'd lost and the years I'd spent rebuilding. She listened with her chin in her hands, her dark eyes solemn and steady, and when I finished, she said, "He didn't deserve you, Mom." "No," I said. "He didn't." But it took me a long time to believe that. "Well, I believe it," she said, and hugged me so hard I felt my ribs creak. "And I'm going to be just like you when I grow up. Except I'm not going to waste 5 years on the wrong person first." "Good plan," I said, and blinked back tears. On the 20th anniversary of the day I walked out of that hospital room, Leo and I sat on the porch of our house, watching the fireflies rise from the garden. Elena was away at college now, studying biomedical engineering at the same university where Leo and I had met. The house felt quiet without her, but it was a good quiet, a peaceful quiet, the kind that settles over a life that has been well lived. Leo reached over and took my hand. His hair was gray now, silver at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we first met. But his grip was the same, steady, warm, sure. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. I was quiet for a moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. I thought about my grandfather, who had taught me to build things and to protect them. I thought about the woman I used to be, the one who waited in empty rooms and poured her heart into thermoses that ended up in the trash. I thought about the baby I'd lost and the daughter I'd raised and the husband who had waited 3 years for a reply to a message he wasn't even sure I'd ever read. "I'm thinking about choices," I said. "How one choice can change everything. How I almost didn't walk out that door. How I almost stayed. But you didn't." "No." I leaned my head against his shoulder. I didn't. The moon rose, full and white. The fireflies winked in the dark. Somewhere far away, the city hummed its endless electric song. I pulled my lab key out of my pocket, the original one, the one Leo had given me in that steamy hot pot restaurant all those years ago. The engraving was worn smooth now, but I could still feel the faint indentations of my initials. 𝐃𝐄𝐒𝐑𝐘 Claire Hastings. The name was mine. It had always been mine. I had just forgotten for a little while. I thought about the recipe that had been found in Ethan's hand, the one I'd written on a scrap of notepaper in a kitchen that no longer existed. I wondered if he'd ever tried to make the soup himself, in some bleak rented room, with a hot plate and a battered pot. I wondered if it had tasted anything like mine. And then I let the thought go, because it didn't matter. The soup had never been about the recipe. It had been about the love I'd poured into it, love that he hadn't been capable of receiving. The recipe was just ink on paper. The love was mine, and I had taken it back. "Happy anniversary," Leo said softly. I turned to look at him. In the moonlight, he looked almost exactly like the man who had once handed me a cup of tea in a grad school lab and said, "You can do better than him, you know." "It's not our anniversary," I said. "That's in October." "I know." He smiled. "I meant the other one. The one you celebrate in your head every year. The day you walked out." I stared at him. "How did you?" "Claire. I've known you for 25 years. I know when you get quiet. I know when you stare at the moon a little longer than usual. I know when you're thinking about the woman you used to be." He squeezed my hand. "So, happy anniversary. You did good." I didn't say anything. I just turned my face into his shoulder and let the tears come, not sad tears, not angry tears, just the clean, simple tears of someone who had finally, after all these years, stopped running. The moon climbed higher. The fireflies danced. And I sat there, surrounded by the life I had built, wrapped in the arms of the man who had always believed I could, and I let myself be exactly who I was. Not the victim. Not the avenger. Not the CEO or the genius or the woman on the magazine covers. Just Claire. Just me. Just free.